What does it mean to change? Not just how people dress, but what clothing says about who a person is allowed to be. In the early 20th century, a woman who had grown up in poverty invented her own biography and taught herself to move through a world that had assigned her no particular place in it, proceeded to dismantle the entire visual vocabulary of how women were expected to present themselves. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Coco Chanel is one of those figures whose names become so attached to luxury and elegance that it is easy to forget what she was actually doing, which was taking apart the system of female dress that enforced a specific idea of femininity, and replacing it with something that allowed women to move. Tonight, we turn to a designer whose innovations were inseparable from a specific historical moment in which the role of women in public life was changing, and whose biography contains contradictions that her legend has often been used to conceal. The question is not only what Chanel changed in fashion, but what her life and her work reveal about the relationship between style, identity, and power in the 20th century.
Chanel understood something that most designers before her did not, that clothing is not only decoration, it is a statement about what kind of person you are, what you are permitted to do, and who has authority over your body. By changing the clothes, she was changing the statement.
We are speaking about Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel, known as Coco Chanel, one of the most influential figures in the history of fashion, and one of the most complex figures in the history of 20th century France.
She built one of the most recognizable brands in the world from almost nothing, and she did it by rejecting almost everything the fashion establishment of her era considered essential. Her innovations were not, they were structural.
Then let us begin with the woman before the legend, and with the distance between the two.
Gabrielle Chanel was born in 1883 in Saumur, in the Loire Valley of France. Her mother passed away when she was 11 or 12, and her father, a street vendor, placed her and her sisters in an orphanage run by nuns in Aubazine, where she remained until her late teens. She learned to sew at the orphanage. The austere visual environment of the institution, the clean lines, the black and white of the nuns' habits, the absence of ornament, is often cited as an influence on the aesthetic sensibility she would develop. Here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account. Chanel spent much of her adult life constructing a false biography. She claimed to have been raised by aunts, denied the orphanage, changed her birth year, and embroidered her early life in ways that made it more romantic and less scandalous by the standards of her era. This self-invention was not incidental to her success. It was part of the product. Coco Chanel was a persona she designed as deliberately as she designed her clothes.
So the woman who became famous for authenticity and simplicity built her public identity on a carefully constructed fiction.
Yes, and understanding this is essential for understanding her. She was not simply expressing a natural sensibility. She was making strategic choices at every level about what to show, what to conceal, and what image to project. The minimalism of her designs was deliberate, and so was the minimalism of the official biography. As a young woman, she worked as a seamstress and performed in cafes in Vichy and Moulins. The name Coco reportedly derives from songs she performed during this period, though the precise origin is disputed. Through relationships with wealthy men, including the English industrialist Arthur Capel, known as Boy, who remained the great love of her life, and whose death in a road accident in 1919 affected her deeply. She gained the financial backing and social access to establish her first millinery shop in Paris in 1910. The fashion world she entered was dominated by elaborate constricting clothing. Women of means wore corsets that reshaped the torso, skirts with heavy layers of fabric, and garments decorated with feathers, ribbons, and extensive ornamentation. The practical effect was to limit movement significantly, and to signal wealth and status through the sheer quantity and complexity of what was worn. Chanel looked at this system and found it absurd.
So she was not simply proposing a different aesthetic. She was proposing a different relationship between women and their own bodies.
Yes. Her early innovation was the use of jersey fabric, a knitted material that had previously been used for men's undergarments. Jersey was comfortable, flexible, and inexpensive. It moved with the body rather than restraining it. Using it for women's outerwear was an aesthetic statement, and a practical one simultaneously. It said that women's clothing should allow women to move as freely as men's clothing allowed men to move. Her use of elements borrowed from masculine dress extended throughout her career. She incorporated trousers, blazers, and sailor-influenced garments for women at a time when such borrowings were considered transgressive. She cut her own hair short, adopting a style then associated with men. She wore the clothes she designed. Each of these choices was a statement about what a woman was permitted to look like, and what that implied about what she was permitted to do.
So she was using her own body and her own appearance as a continuous demonstration of the argument her clothes were making.
Yes. The little black dress, which she introduced in 1926, was perhaps the clearest expression of her philosophy. Black had previously been worn primarily for mourning. Chanel proposed it as a universal, elegant, and infinitely adaptable garment. The Vogue editor who published it described it as the Ford of fashion, a democratizing object that would be worn by women of all classes. The comparison was apt. Like the Model T, it made something previously associated with privilege accessible through simplification. Chanel No. 5, created in collaboration with the perfumer Ernest Beau in 1921, was a different kind of innovation. Previous perfumes had been built around single floral notes. Beau created a complex synthetic fragrance using aldehydes that had no direct natural equivalent. Chanel named it No. 5 after the sample she selected and presented it in a minimalist bottle that was itself a design statement. The perfume became one of the most commercially successful products in the history of luxury goods.
So the minimalism of the bottle was as much a design choice as the minimalism of the dress.
Yes. And the perfume expanded what Chanel was selling beyond clothing. It sold a concept of femininity, a mood, an identity. This was a structural shift in the luxury goods business. Chanel was not simply designing clothes. She was creating a world with a consistent aesthetic that could be inhabited through clothing, accessories, fragrance, and eventually through the entire apparatus of the modern luxury branding. The Chanel suit, developed in the 1920s and refined over subsequent decades, became the definitive expression of her approach to formal dress. The collarless jacket in boucle tweed, the chain-weighted hem that kept the jacket in place, the easy skirt. Each element was functional as well as elegant. The suit allowed a woman to move with authority, sit without worrying about wrinkles, and project professional competence. It became the standard dress of powerful women across the 20th century.
So the suit was a garment designed for a woman who had somewhere to go and something to do when she got there.
Precisely. And this alignment between her designs and the social changes affecting women in the early and mid-20th century is central to her historical significance. Her innovations did not occur in a vacuum. They occurred in a period when women were entering the workforce in larger numbers, gaining the vote, and reshaping their public roles. Chanel's clothes were not the cause of those changes, but they were a precise expression of them, and they accelerated the visual vocabulary through which those changes were communicated. Her activities during the Second World War are the most controversial aspect of her biography. She closed her couture house in 1939 at the outbreak of the war and remained in Paris during the German occupation. She conducted a relationship with a German officer, Hans Gunther von den Klage, and lived at the Ritz Hotel, which served as a center of German military and social activity during the occupation. There is evidence that she was involved in intelligence activities on behalf of German authorities, including a mission to Madrid in 1943, that appears to have been arranged with German support.
So the period of the occupation represents a dimension of her life that her official legend has largely obscured.
Yes, she was arrested briefly at the liberation but released without prosecution, reportedly through the intervention of Winston Churchill, with whom she had a long social acquaintance. The full picture of her wartime activities has been reconstructed only gradually through archival research, and the implications remain contested. What is not contested is that she benefited from proximity to German authority during the occupation, and that this benefit included attempts to exploit wartime laws to strip Jewish business partners of their ownership stakes in her company. The role of her male patrons and partners in her rise is a dimension of her biography that requires careful handling. Chanel benefited materially from relationships with wealthy and influential men, including Boy Capel, the Duke of Westminster, and others. This is sometimes used to diminish her achievement, implying that her success was a product of patronage rather than talent. The more accurate account is that she navigated the only routes available to a woman of her background in early 20th century France with extraordinary skill, converting the access those relationships provided into an independent commercial and creative enterprise that outlasted every one of them.
So she used the system's existing channels to build something that eventually operated outside the system.
Yes, and the speed and completeness with which she converted early patronage into independent authority is itself evidence of the talent and intelligence she brought to the enterprise. Her competitors in haute couture at the time included Poiret and Vionnet, both of whom had access to resources, established reputations, and the full support of the fashion establishment. She overtook them through the clarity and consistency of her aesthetic vision, and through her understanding of what women actually wanted to wear. Her relationship with costume jewelry is another dimension of her aesthetic philosophy that had significant commercial and cultural consequences. Traditional luxury fashion had insisted on real precious stones and insisted on real precious stones. Chanel introduced costume jewelry pieces made from glass, paste and base metals, and wore it without apology alongside her most elegant clothes. This was a direct challenge to the idea that luxury required expensive materials. She was arguing that the design and the visual effect were what mattered, not the intrinsic value of what produced them.
So, costume jewelry was not a compromise, but a philosophical position.
Yes, and this position had democratic implications, even though Chanel herself was not a democrat in any political sense. If the effect of elegance could be produced without expensive materials, then elegance was not exclusively the property of those who could afford expensive materials. The logic, once introduced, was difficult to contain. It contributed to the broader democratization of fashion that accelerated through the 20th century, as mass production and synthetic materials extended the visual vocabulary of luxury downward through the social scale. The tanning of skin, which Chanel reportedly popularized after being accidentally sunburned on a Mediterranean holiday in the 1920s, is a smaller but telling example of how her personal choices became cultural statements. Before Chanel's influence, pale skin was associated with leisure class status, the mark of a person who did not work outdoors. A suntan was associated with manual labor. Chanel's visible tan reframed it as a sign of active leisure, of travel and outdoor sport, transforming what the skin communicated about its owner.
So even a suntan became a signal in a system of meanings. She was actively reshaping.
Yes, this sensitivity to the semiotics of appearance, to what physical details communicate about a person's status, values, and identity, was at the core of her genius. She understood fashion not as decoration, but as a system of signs, and she was one of the most skilled manipulators of that system in the 20th century. The irony is that a woman who fabricated her own biography so extensively also created some of the most powerful visual vocabulary through which other women expressed their authentic selves.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to understand Chanel as both an innovator and a complex historical figure, where would you invite them to continue in?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Coco Chanel, The Legend and the Life by Justine Picardie.
So this is a biography that takes seriously both the creative achievement and the contradictions.
Picardie combines biography with cultural analysis, examining Chanel's rise from poverty to global influence, her revolutionary impact on fashion, and the contradictions within her personal life. The book presents Chanel as both an innovator and a controversial figure, offering a nuanced understanding of her legacy that does not reduce her either to an inspirational story or to her wartime conduct.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in fashion history?
Picardie writes with a novelist's sensibility and a biographer's rigor. No prior knowledge of fashion is required. The book is equally a study of how a woman from the margins of French society constructed a position of cultural authority in a world that offered her no obvious path to one.
So it gives the reader both the designer and the woman navigating a world that was not designed for her.
Precisely. And Picardie does not shy away from the wartime period or from the self-mythologization. The legend and the life of the title are both present throughout, and the gap between them is part of what makes the book essential.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
After the liberation, Chanel went into self-imposed exile in Switzerland, living in Lausanne for most of the late 1940s. She returned to Paris in 1954 at the age of 70 and reopened her couture house. The French fashion press was largely hostile. Her first collection after the return was dismissed by many French critics as too simple and too English. It was received far more enthusiastically in the United States and Britain. The return was a commercial, and eventually a cultural success. The Chanel suit became the defining garment of the 1950s and 60s for a specific kind of powerful woman. The politician's wife, the executive, the woman who needed to project authority in formal settings, without the elaborate structures of haute couture. When Jacqueline Kennedy wore a pink Chanel-style suit on the day of President Kennedy's assassination in 1963, the image became one of the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century.
So the return established the brand's second life, which proved as durable as the first.
Yes, Chanel passed away in January 1971 at the Ritz Hotel in Paris at the age of 87. While still working, she had reportedly said that she would rather pass away on her feet. The house she had founded continued under the creative direction of Karl Lagerfeld from 1983 onward, who sustained and extended her aesthetic vocabulary for 4 decades while adding his own interpretations. The broader legacy of her work in fashion is the democratization of elegance as a concept. Before Chanel, elegance in women's dress required elaborate construction, expensive materials, and significant physical discomfort. After Chanel, elegance could be achieved through simplicity, proportion, and quality of fabric. This shift in the definition of what elegant meant changed what luxury fashion was selling, and opened the concept to a far wider range of expressions.
So she changed not just fashion, but the idea of what fashion was trying to achieve.
Yes. And this conceptual shift is her most durable contribution. The wartime period is a permanent complication to the legend, and it is right that it should be. But the aesthetic and cultural transformation she produced was genuine, was historically significant, and was inseparable from the specific social changes of the early 20th century. The two things coexist in her biography, as they coexist in the biographies of many figures who produced significant work within morally compromised lives. The modern relevance of her story is perhaps most visible in the debate it continues to generate about how we assess creative legacy in relation to personal conduct. Chanel's case is a particularly clear version of a question that appears repeatedly in cultural history. Can we separate what a person made from what they did? The answer is rarely simple, and the discomfort of holding both things simultaneously is part of what makes the question worth returning to.
So her legacy forces the question, admiration and accountability are...
Yes, and the answer her biography suggests is that they must be, because neither the achievement nor the conduct can be made to disappear by emphasizing only the other. She changed how women dressed and how they were seen, and she made choices during the occupation that compromised people whose vulnerability she could have chosen to protect. Both statements are true. Holding them together is what understanding her actually requires. The tension in her legacy between the emancipatory dimension of her work and the conduct of her wartime years is not unique to Chanel. It is a recurring feature of figures who produce genuine cultural change from positions of social marginality. People who succeed despite the systems that excluded them do not automatically become critics of those systems. Chanel escaped poverty and social invisibility by learning to operate within the structures of power, and when those structures were occupied by German authority, she made choices that reflected her priorities clearly.
So survival instinct and moral failure can be expressions of the same underlying orientation.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable thing her biography offers. The same capacity for strategic self-interest that allowed her to build an empire from nothing also shaped her choices when the occupation made collaboration the path of least resistance. The legend she constructed concealed the connection. The historical record, gradually recovered, makes it visible again.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the orphanage, the jersey fabric, the little black dress, the wartime occupation, and the return that kept the name alive long enough for the contradictions to become part of actions, to become part of the history.
Chanel reminds us that the most consequential forms of power are often those that change what people cannot imagine themselves without, and that the person who builds that power is not always someone whose choices bear close examination.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.